everyone, I'm Carly, and I'm sad to say that physical exercise can actually improve your mental and sexual well-being. Welcome to Read Receipts, and welcome to our Summer of Love feature event, the Come As You Are miniseries, where we dive into topics from the book by the same name by Emily Nagoski. While you certainly can learn a lot about your sexuality from this series, I highly recommend reading her book, listening to her book, buying her book, whatever you would like to do to support her, because Emily has done a lot of great work and research to put all this information together. And if you want a deeper understanding about all the stuff that we talk about, you're gonna get it here. Thank you, Emily, for your contributions to society. I look up to you as the aliens in the movie Toy Story look up to the cloth. In case you missed it, there are 2 other episodes where we talk about the basics and not so basics of our sexual being. If you haven't watched those yet, I recommend you check them out. As for today's episode, we are going to be diving a little bit deeper into topics by talking about the external factors that affect our sexual being. You might remember in the last episode, we started talking about context, and so we're going to be talking about context again, but we are going to be breaking it down into 2 different types of context, which is emotional context and cultural context. So first, we're going to start with emotional context, and the 2 prime emotions that tend to affect our sexual pleasure are stress and love. And when thinking of these emotions, we're going to really be thinking down to our primal needs, like 3 to 4 words, thinking things like I am at risk versus I'm at safe, things like that. And so we're going to start off here talking about stress, because obviously that tends to usually be more of what affects our sexual pleasure, which you might be thinking, no shit, of course stress is going to affect whether or not I want to have sex. But I think it's important to recognize and validate just how much stress can impact our sexual lives, because our bodies really know no difference between what is like a serious threat versus like our everyday typical threats. Let's go back to thinking about things in the primal sense. Say you are face to face with a lion. Obviously, when you're in that situation, you're going to be in survival mode. Sex is not going to be a factor in the equation at all. Who is even thinking about sex in this moment? You're just trying to live. And that's completely normal, and that's what we would expect. But nowadays, obviously, we might not be running into as much of that same like threat level as to our lives, but our bodies don't know the difference. Your body is going to respond the same way to a mean email from Carol at work as your body would respond to a lion in your face. Your body's still going to see this as a threat to your well-being and respond and activate the same way. Now, as far as managing stress, a lot of people might think that just simply eliminating what this stressor is from your life can help. And while certainly that might solve a problem in your life, it's not going to necessarily eliminate the stress that that event caused. What you're going to need to do is complete the stress cycle. You likely are familiar with the stress responses known as fight or flight, but for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to add a 3rd one into the mix as well, known as freeze. So we're going to be talking about fight, flight, or freeze. So when we perceive a threat, we are going to be responding with one of these 3 options, depending on what our minds, bodies, whatever, think most fits the scenario. And by us engaging in one of these stress responses, we are actually completing the stress cycle. The example that Emily gives that I love and literally changed the way that I think about stress and self-care is going to go back to our example with the lion. If you were to come face to face with a lion, odds are you're going to assess the situation and say, I need to go. And so then you would run, and then you would keep running until you feel like you are in the clear. And then you would stop, and then once you've stopped, you would feel okay. Because you have reached a point of safety, you no longer feel stressed. So if we were to scope out and look at this whole process from beginning to end, you assess the threat, you engage in an action, and then by doing that action, you reach a point of safety. I shit you not, this is why annoying people will tell you that physical exercise is good for your mental health. It is literally engaging the fight, flight, or freeze stress response system to facilitate that stress moving out of your body. Granted, this is just one strategy that you can use to simulate completing the cycle, but especially if you identify your response with the flight response, then doing something like running or walking can pair really well with that particular response. Similarly, if you are experiencing a fight response, you might want to engage in an activity that helps you feel as though you are conquering your stress. So engaging in something like kickboxing, punching a bag, maybe even doing a rage room, something that really is like a much more active experience of getting out your physical stress. But one thing that I really like is that Emily points out that it doesn't necessarily have to be you experiencing a physical activity to engage your fight response. For instance, she goes back to that lion example and say instead of you running from the lion, you go back to your tribe, get your community with you, and then go back to the lion and fight the lion together. There are real world applications of this that we do in our daily lives that I believe is an example of completing the fight stress response. So, that email from Carol that I mentioned, that was not just a quip. That is a real life thing that has happened recently to my partner. One day, she got an unnecessarily mean email from a coworker, and it naturally really upset her. So, she took the email to our group chat with our friends, and basically we began completely roasting this woman. Of course, in the process, we were validating my partner's feelings, but we also were in a way fighting her lion, if this lion were the coworker / the email specifically. Even though we never talked to this woman, everything that we said stayed within this chat. This woman has no idea what happened outside of the confines of Outlook. We basically were fighting a lion for her. And genuinely, by the end of this mass roasting session, my partner felt a lot better. I think it doubled as a way for her to naturally get out her feelings and talk through that as well. But by all of us validating her feelings and engaging in this sort of group activity, it kind of counted as affection, albeit a very different looking kind of affection than you might normally expect. But we were supporting her and we were fighting on her behalf in that moment. Now, naturally, when we think about fight and flight, those both feel like very active stress responses, but then we also have freeze over here, where our body's response is to shut down in the face of a threat. If we were to look at a possum in a similar situation, they would likely play dead and then wait out the situation until they felt as though their threat has gone away. And then once they feel they are in the clear, they begin to shake off the stress and give a big sigh. AKA, this is an example of somatic movement. So even in the stress response of freeze, where it feels like, yeah, you do nothing, it actually does help once again to engage in a form of kind of physical movement. Which again, if you're someone like me who hates moving, this is really bad news. But if you are like me and don't necessarily want to always do physical activity to alleviate stress, these are just a few examples of some of the things you can do. There are lots of different ways that you can engage your stress cycle to help complete the cycle. Some other examples of things you can engage in are sleep, affection, see the story where we roasted the woman, any form of meditation, or you could even do some crying or screaming. Emily also mentions grooming as an option, as something that she's seen that seems like it really helps in a similar way, but she does caveat that it's not necessarily backed by science in the sense that people have done experiments on it and stuff like that and really tracked that information. But keep that in mind that it feels like a pretty solid option, even if it's not necessarily been tested. I will say this is all obviously a lot easier said than done, especially when you consider the fact that the types of stresses that we are dealing with nowadays are very different from the kind that we face in the primal days. Because while facing a lion in theory feels like a lot more stressful of a threat, it's also acute. There's a very clear beginning, middle, end. As long as you are able to escape the lion, then that stress is gone. Whereas nowadays, our stressors tend to be more chronic in the sense that they might be lower intensity, but they tend to be a lot longer in duration. And so because of that, you really have to take deliberate steps to complete the stress response cycle for yourself, so that way that stress doesn't build up over time and then as a result makes you sick. This can definitely be extra hard in a society like ours where we're expected to suppress our emotions, usually for other people's comfort. But hopefully the examples I gave can help in creating a context that can help you facilitate the cycle completion. So naturally, stress is a big one. There's lots of ways to deal with stress, but there is a chance that love is also kind of a problem that is affecting your sexual pleasure. This can be especially hard to grapple with if you are someone that feels like you are in an otherwise loving relationship. And it doesn't help that odds are if you are here, it's because you also are a romance reader. Even if you do romantasy, you still probably read a form of romance. And by that, you probably see a lot of sex on the page. And not only that, when we are seeing that sex on the page, we are seeing it as a behavioral marker for attachment. It is in these books advancing the plot because once these characters have sex, they are really creating an attachment for themselves. and now the story continues from here. And unfortunately, because of the nature of these books, we are usually only seeing the beginning of the relationship, and so we are only seeing sex that is kind of usually accomplishing that specific thing. And so the IRL takeaway that we tend to get is that this makes sense. Sex is fun and exciting in the beginning of our relationships because we have plot. But now that we don't, now that we've kind of reached our happily ever after, we're with the person that we wanted to be with, yeah, bad conclusion. So Emily posits that there is a simple solution to this, that we can simply add more plot to our lives, but we will discuss that in a later episode. But to go back to attachment styles, if you're not familiar, this is how we connect with our romantic partner. And if you grew up in a safe and reliable household, then congrats, you likely have a secure attachment style. This means that you are comfortable sharing your thoughts and feelings with your partner, you're not fearful that they will leave you, and you're comfortable turning to your partner for help. But if you are like half of Americans who didn't have this experience, then you likely developed an insecure attachment style. Yay! There are two different types of attachment styles. There's anxious and avoidant. Anxious looks like, I'm afraid my partner won't stay with me. I worry that my partner doesn't really love me. And avoidant looks like, I prefer not to show my partner my feelings, and I prefer not to get too close to my romantic partners. And what's even crazier about this is that not only can your attachment style change over the course of your life, it can also change from partner to partner. It can change over the course of one single relationship. So it's very possible that you could be sitting here thinking, well, I've definitely felt anxious attachment style, but now maybe I feel avoidant or vice versa. And that is completely possible. I'll be honest that I think that probably the best way to kind of grapple with these feelings is likely to just get therapy and to work with a professional on this. But if you're looking for something to kind of take away for now, something that Emily brings up in her book, and I'm laughing a little bit because it does feel a little bit silly to say out loud, but it's also kind of a cute metaphor, is to treat communicating about sex and love as though it is a sleepy hedgehog. Let me explain. First, you're going to find out what the hedgehog's name is, aka I feel blank. I feel sad. I feel mad. You should probably use more descriptive words than I am, but we are just in a podcast right now giving examples. Then you are going to sit peacefully with the hedgehog without judgment or shame, aka you're going to acknowledge these feelings, kind of sit with them and feel them a little bit without necessarily feeling bad about whether or not you've had these feelings or any particular way, really. And then you are going to listen to its needs, figure out what will help alleviate this feeling. And then lastly, you're going to communicate both the feeling and the needs that you think will help with this. Because while this might start as your feelings, it is important to remember that this hedgehog is something you share. It takes two to come to a solution with kindness that satisfies all parties. So that concludes the emotional context that we were going to talk about, but there's a possibility that none of that felt relevant to you, and that's because there is a very unfortunate possibility that external factors have been more in play with your life than internal ones. You can have everything figured out for yourself in terms of emotions and blah, 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 but external factors are going to leave their mark whether you want them to or not. Things like our families, our culture are capable of doing damage, and oftentimes we're left to pick up those pieces. There are 3 core cultural messages that Emily outlines in her book, and we're going to kind of talk through them. We're going to deconstruct them a little bit. But I do want to acknowledge that at the end of this, as we go through all this, I'm not necessarily saying that you have to disagree with all of these messages. I will be frank that in a lot of cases, some of these beliefs will likely impede on your sexual experiences one way or another. But the problem with these messages is that oftentimes we did not really have a say in us believing them. They were passed down to us. They were bestowed upon us. And then it just became something that suddenly was part of our psyche that we had no say in. And so by us going through this and talking through them, I really want for all of us to make a choice as we go through it and choose whether or not we still want to believe in these messages. And that is what is important at the end of the day, is that it's only fair that we get to have a say in whether or not we want this to be a part of our beliefs. So the first one is the moral message, and that is what tells us that we are bad if we like or want to have sex, or we lose our virginity when we shouldn't, or if we've had too many sexual partners. It sends the message that identifying with sex in any way is immoral. And it's really crazy to think about how pervasive this belief can be. For instance, when I first read this, I naturally was like, well, this doesn't apply to me. This isn't really something that I deal with. I didn't grow up in a very religious household. I did get some influences from like the kids that I went to school with and stuff like that of religion. And so sometimes some of those like moral messages did seep through in that way. But then especially by the time I went to college, and as I talked about, I went through this campaign where I relayed a lot of sex positive information. I felt as though, yeah, I no longer believe these things, yada, yada, yada. But something that has kind of come up even as I've gotten older is that I still will sometimes feel guilt around the thought of wanting to have sex. I feel immediately at fault for caring about how often I might have sex, if it's a satisfactory amount to me, for even feeling as though it's an important part of a relationship, because for some reason, the moral message has taught me that that is something that is shallow to care about. That is not what is important in a relationship, and probably makes me a slut, because that always comes up. And it really wasn't until I revisited this section that I realized that the moral message was winning in this instance, where it was telling me as though this was not okay for me to feel, when it is. Sex is a very important part of our relationships if it is important to us. All things considered, you are more than willing and allowed to like sex and want sex, and as long as all relevant parties consent, it is completely okay. Then there is the medical message that says sex is dangerous. You can get a disease, or heaven forbid, you get teen pregnancy at the age of 30. And if you have sex, it has to be in perfect alignment with your male partner. And if not, you need a doctor to fix you. And because of this overarching theme, odds are you have heard the dumbest shit ever to scare you away from sex or to seek unnecessary medical treatment. And what's scariest is that you might have heard something early on in your life and just simply believed it because obviously you didn't know better. Heck, it might have even been true at the time, and it wasn't until further research later in your life that you might find out that it wasn't true, and it might just be a matter of sheer luck whether you happen to finally get to know the correct information. Don't feel bad if this does happen to you. If, for instance, in the first couple of episodes, there was something that you didn't know about your body that you have since learned to be true, it is not your fault. There has been a very intentional lack of education around sex because our society is so uncomfortable with it and feel as though a lack of education for us is better, even though it clearly is not. But this is where I will say that the optimist in me sees the internet as kind of a good place, because there's never been a better time to be able to find a real life doctor on TikTok, or find a scientist with a podcast, or a girl who has a podcast where she read a book once, where you can kind of find that information for yourself and get some more clarity. Of course, there's going to be a degree of vetting that you're going to need to do because the internet is the internet. Nothing is safe anymore. But reliable information is out there. And as far as STIs and pregnancy go, there are lots of ways to prevent those things, and they are all safe and do not have to inhibit you from a positive sexual experience. And then lastly, the final one is the media message, which ultimately says you are inadequate. And this covers so much. It's what tells us that you're too fat, you're too thin, your boobs are too big, your boobs are too small. You need to be more confident, but you can't be conceited. You've never had an orgasm. You don't own a vibrator. You've only had one sexual partner. Have you ever tried this one? It felt like it fit in, okay? What can I say? Honestly, you can just drop the whole Barbie speech in here and it gets the idea across. In my opinion, this feels like it's the hardest to overcome because it's everywhere. Sometimes it feels like once you've finally conquered one insecurity that kind of pertains to this message, suddenly a new one pops up. Like, tell me why suddenly I now care about hip dips. I don't. I've kind of gotten over that one. But still, for the moment, the internet made me think that I should care about that, and that's fucking stupid. And also, I'm not saying you're stupid if you do care about that, but maybe think about that more, because that's something silly that you shouldn't be insecure about. But all that to say, it feels as though it can be a never-ending cycle and that it's exhausting. And it doesn't help that the wealthier and more influential people of the world have no incentive to help us dispel this because they profit off of us having these insecurities. And even knowing that isn't great, because sometimes I can convince myself that I don't need to be insecure because I'm just feeding the capitalist system by being insecure about my body, and they just want me to buy products and blah, blah, blah. And that works for a little bit, and then usually it still comes creeping back in. But if that's something that does help your thought process, remember that. But the main way to sort of treat this in general is to just treat yourself with kindness and self-compassion. And as far as our thoughts about our bodies and how it pertains to sex, there is a direct trade-off. with our sexual well-being and self-critical thoughts about our bodies. Women who feel worse about their bodies tend to have less satisfying sex, more pain, riskier sex, and more unwanted consequences. So how does one go about feeling better about their bodies? Basically, it takes a lot of deconstructing these messages, and therapy certainly will help too. I will say there are two major beliefs that Emily helps really dig into and disprove in her book. One being that self-criticism is good for you, and another that fat is bad for you. And just to be clear, these are the beliefs. Emily is disproving them. But since this is already a larger topic and for brevity, I'm not going to really get into that here. This is where I'm going to say get into her book if you want to hear a little bit more about that and her thought processes, because I think she does do a good job of really digging into it and helping kind of dispel that thought process that we might have. I will, however, read one quote that came up from this section kind of around this area of the book because I just really love it, that Emily says. She says, "Remind yourself that the day you were born, your body was cause for celebration, for love without condition, and that's just as true today as it was then." And that literally makes me want to cry. I totally understand if this is all really overwhelming. I kind of feel like in some ways this is the heaviest episode because, yeah, it's just crazy to think how many things have influenced the way we feel about not only sex, but about ourselves. But I do want to impart some hope into you guys that these beliefs were never inherent to you. These were learned, and they can be unlearned. There may be things that you don't want to unlearn from your life, and that's okay. You get to choose, as long as at the end of the day you are doing something that brings you joy and peace. And ideally an orgasm, because that's like kind of what we're here for, but you know. And that concludes the third episode of our series. Thank you all so much for checking out this episode. Be sure to come back next time where we do some debunking. We're going to be going through some myths about how sex works so that way you can feel more empowered in your own sexuality. Have a sexy summer of love, y'all. All of the content that you hear in this podcast is curated, recorded, and edited by me, truly, with special thanks to the authors of the books that we cover, Emily Nagoski, and Pixabay for the music that we play. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you like to listen, and for more of our content in between shows, you can find us at the Read Receipts Pod on Instagram and TikTok. We read all of your comments and love all your likes, so please, please, please follow along. Until our next read, bye!